Yes, Wayne has entered the building. We can now begin. Awesome. My name is Austin Arnsberg. I run Octa Ventures, and I will be moderating the panel today. The panel is called Why VCs Want to Fund Identity Startups in 2024. VCs being venture capitalists, not verifiable credentials. Important distinction to start off at an identity conference. That being said, we could talk about verifiable credentials. And then I have two friends, first and foremost, but also co-investors that Octa Ventures has worked with on the panel as well. And we're here to honestly answer the questions that you all have. We'll kick off and kind of stimulate the discussion, but would really encourage you to raise your hand and interject. This is super casual. And we'll leave plenty of time at the end to try and stimulate discussions. When I work with we have 35 companies in our portfolio. We do monthly portfolio operator workshops, and I tend to call out people in those workshops. So I might point to some of you all and ask, what are you thinking about on this topic, just to keep it spicy and keep everybody engaged. Because I assume if you've came into this room that you probably have something you're thinking about, and chances are we may not cover it. So always happy to answer any questions you all have. So with that, I'll pass over to Suman, who can introduce herself.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to come. So my name is Suman Natarajan, and I'm at a firm called B Capital. We're a global investment firm investing in startups from seed to pre-IPO, and have a presence here in the U.S. and across Asia with about $6 billion under management. We have a strategic partnership with BCG. We have a few different domains that we focus on. One of our biggest is enterprise, and within that, I spend time on growth companies in enterprise software with a focus on cyber and other enterprise infrastructure spaces. But great to be here today.
And my name is John Brennan. I'm the managing partner of a new firm called Holly Ventures. I spent the last 7 years with YL Ventures doing seed stage investing in Israeli cybersecurity companies. Under my new banner, I'll be doing all seed stage, all cybersecurity, which would include identity, although we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Based in San Francisco, the majority of the investments I do are out of Israel, but I invest in the U.S. and all over the world as well. And thank you, Austin, for including me today.
Cool, thanks. The other thing that's also important to mention is that if you're interested or you have a startup or you want to have discussions, just come up to us afterwards, tap us on the shoulder. That's kind of the reason why we're doing this, is because we don't know who's out there that's interested in engaging on the investing side of things. And then as well, if you have any other friends or somebody that's raising, always feel free to reach out. That's our business. So let me kick off actually and maybe ask you, Suman, what do you think is sort of the difference between identity and cyber? Because we sort of see two sides of the same coin, identity as a tool for enablement and identity as a tool for security. So how do you sort of frame it in your mind, and how does your firm think about it?
Yeah, I definitely think about identity as kind of within the umbrella of cybersecurity, but it is really interesting because it touches a number of different use cases. So in addition to security specifically, it also touches privacy, it touches fraud and risk management, and it has, I think what's most interesting about it is that it has an end user component. And so while we think about traditional cyber companies, often, at the network level, at the endpoint level, and so forth, the technology exists across the infrastructure, but very few people actually have to interact with it. And with identity, it's very different. Not only do you need to be very savvy about the architecture and the engineering and scaling the technology out, but you also have to think about the end user experience. And I think the type of problems that you're solving are just, very interesting from once you kind of add that element in. So, I think that's kind of how I would define the difference, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think when I think about investing, I try to be very customer-centric. And so I try to look at opportunities through the eyes of generally the chief information security officer. And because I'm investing in companies that are just an idea, it's a PowerPoint presentation and a few people, I always try to really help these companies focus on a use case, focus on a go-to-market motion. And, of course, over time, you want to be big and build a platform. But one of the things that I've found in identity that can be tricky is if you're selling into multiple stakeholders within an organization. So listen, convincing a security team that your product is going to bring value is hard enough. And then if you have to convince the security team that you're going to bring value, and then you need to help them convince other folks at the organization that they're going to bring value, it really makes the go-to-market motion difficult when you don't have a big team built out. And so from a customer perspective, I will say that identity was not, 5, 6, 7 years ago, the typical chief information security officer, I'm not sure identity was at the top of their list in terms of what they were thinking about. I do think it is now. And I think that's actually a good thing for the security community in general, because I think it's going to make it easier for a lot of these companies to get off the ground.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive, actually. But for the longest time, Okta itself didn't fully identify really as a security company, although, of course, people on the outside would have thought that. But even if you went to like the RSA Security Conference this year, we really came out in a strong force, had a big marketing message, a bunch of activities. But for the longest time, it was really an enablement story. And even in the public markets, security was kind of a bad word for the first 10 years, I would say, of Okta's growth. So it's interesting that people are sort of changing I'd say maybe not changing, but widening their aperture for what applications identity has in other areas. Let me jump to, I guess, like the trendiest question right now, which is what applications do you see AI in identity right now in terms of startups, or any startups that you see that are using AI in some interesting way in identity?
So one thing that I'm really excited about in how AI can actually be pretty disruptive for identity is just around the policy management side. I think there are some companies that are trying to experiment here, but I think that's a huge opportunity, not only in automating workflows, but just in kind of collapsing the complexity of like rules that we have to be interoperable across every single system, environment, application, user, etc. It is a mess, and I think that's why identity remains such kind of a rich problem space to be innovating in. But I think there can be some like pretty big disruptions enabled with AI if kind of harnessed around that specific area. And then once solved, if you're able to actually solve that and kind of be the basis for being able to absorb very natural policies that are in natural language, translate that across, and not have to manage like such complex rules, that knowledge can be harnessed across so many different use cases. So I think that's kind of one kind of breakthrough area that I'm hoping to see folks take on.
Yeah, I don't know how unique this is to identity necessarily, but I think the idea of being able to generate higher fidelity alerts, eliminate a lot of the noise. I mean, so many of the tools out there right now generate a lot of information, but if you can't prioritize that, or especially with identity, if you're going to disrupt business processes with some of the actions that you're probably supposed to take with some of these alerts, it can be really challenging. And so I think from a identity detection response perspective, I think from a prevention perspective, I think that it's not necessarily reinventing anything, but I think a lot of the promises that companies have made around being able to detect things and respond to them in a timely manner that can actually do prevention, I think AI is going to allow not just identity vendors, actually vendors across the security spectrum, to fulfill some of the promises, honestly, that they've been making for years and years. And these are really hard problems to solve. And it's, sometimes I think people kind of roll their eyes. If I had answered first, I was going to say, well, everyone threw AI in their pitch, because that's really what's happened so far. But I actually think there's a lot of value improved value that people are bringing right now.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thank you for asking. You deserve an award for breaking this up. Yeah, seriously. There's someone clapping behind you, so go for it.
What do you think are the top 3 problems or pains that the CISO or the stakeholder are feeling around the identity? And also, if you think that the CISO is more care about the consumer side of it, like if I'm a B2C company, does the CISO feel any pains around the consumers?
So just to repeat the question, top 3 things that CISO is thinking about around identity, and then for consumer companies, how are they thinking about identity? I'll tackle the last one first, just that one, and then I'll let you all touch base on the other questions. One of the things that we've invested upon, actually, is kids' identity. So when you think about consumer identity, right? I don't know how many people are under the age of 18, but they fall under totally different compliance and rules. Believe it or not, this is a really underinvested area. I'm blown away by it, to be frank. So for anybody who has kids here, right? If you have Nintendo, Steam, there's all sorts of different platforms that basically, when kids say that they're under 18, it kind of kicks them into a parental platform. That's fascinating. And a lot of the gaming companies, actually, in some of the research that we've done, Epic, for instance, went out and bought a company called Super Awesome, which does some kids' age verification work. But if you think about it, like the big gaming platforms, which are the perfect example of a consumer platform, I mean, millions, billions of user sessions in a month, they have no interest in being involved in anything to do with kids' age verification. Imagine if you're the CEO of Activision, EA Sports, whatever, you don't want to be called into Congress asking why it is that you're giving permissioned access to kids simply because they say that they're over 18. So a really acute problem, actually, there's 30 different countries with regulations right now around kids' age verification and very few tools. So for anybody who's interested in starting a startup in that space, I would say jump into it because I'm amazed at how few startups are addressing it right now. Very acute issue, and from a consumer identity standpoint, actually gaming is literally how young children begin their digital life. Right? They start in school, and then they start actually in gaming. And that has some really interesting implications when you start thinking about kids' wallets, right? And verifiable credentials. We were talking to a company just here in the room about verifiable credentials. Well, kids think about that in terms of badges, right? What level are they? What games are they, right? So it has all sorts of different implications. So I think that's one piece of it from the consumer identity side. The other one is interesting that we've invested in is a company called Intrinsic, which is doing AI content moderation. And that's really a post-authentication story, right? So if you think of Okta, right, we control, obviously, authentication and authorization in different forms, but any identity company that allows people in, right, most of those are not thinking about, well, what happens when that user's inside the platform, post-auth? They can still be abusive. They could still be sharing CSAM. They could do all sorts of nefarious activities. So making a connection and being able to find the post-auth abuse, I think, will be increasingly important for people that are thinking about security holistically, right? So a lot of the companies that are giving access into that door, they need to start thinking about, well, what is this user doing after they've authenticated? And the same thing goes for, insider threat access and everything else on a workforce identity side. So I think totally different set of issues on consumer, and it's a really good question. But pass over to you for the CISO questions.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think what I'm hearing from CISOs they're still tackling kind of pretty fundamental and foundational challenges. It's not necessarily like net new areas. I hear a lot about like access to dev tools. Still how to manage like PAM. Like it's still a problem, and it continues to be. Understanding, employee behavior, like workforce kind of activity and behavior, being able to report on it. And in real time, understand what their risks are across all of their assets. I think people still are kind of holding together their organization with rubber bands and duct tape, and so it's still navigating those complexities. I think is what I hear from CISOs as problems today. But I think there are other areas that are pretty interesting, but are not necessarily getting called out by CISOs that are identity relevant. There's one thing that's happened that I'm sure folks are aware of on the customer or consumer identity space. With all of the kind of new cookies rules, there's been kind of a masking or blindness on the customer identities. And so we're seeing a lot of e-commerce companies really struggling with understanding who their customers are, if they're a new customer or repeat customer. And it's, even if there are only a small percentage of end users who are actually clicking like decline, which I am one of those people, but it's still a small percentage in total. It still represents a huge amount of market share. And these companies are really struggling across managing kind of that. I would say it's kind of like a marketing and data problem. And so there are a lot of companies that are trying to solve both on the consent management side, but also on the user activity side. So people can at least get some intelligence on those users, even if they're not capturing like the actual PII. for that individual. So that's kind of on the marketing side, but very, very identity focused as well. But I think those are two areas.
So I'll add one with a massive caveat. Non-human identity is or machine identity, I don't know what people are calling it right now. It is a topic almost every chief information security officer I talk to is interested in. Because of that, there is a massive overfunding of these kind of companies already, and there's a bunch that people know about, and I know a bunch more in stealth that haven't even announced themselves yet. I think it's a real problem. I think it's a great use case, and I think it's very important. No one has been able to articulate to me yet why that shouldn't just be part of your privileged access management or your IGA program. And so I worry, and maybe the data security posture management, the DSPM space is an example of this. Everyone wanted to talk about it. Everyone was really interested in where their data was in the cloud, and then all the VCs funded a bunch of folks, and everyone raised money, and then when it came to budgets, all of a sudden the bar went up a little bit, and the CSPMs can kind of do most of this, and it became a really hard go-to-market motion, and the majority of those DSPMs ended up being parked. A lot of them were good exits, but I wouldn't say they were amazing exits. I worry that we are in a similar cycle right now with non-human identity. It is a real problem. It is a great topic, and it needs to be solved. I just don't know why it needs to be a siloed solution in addition to your other tools, and I think there's a lot of money in the space right now. The next few years will bear that out. But I think non-human identity, at least as a topic, is very important right now.
Wait, so John, on that piece, do you think that it's better to be kind of building like as an entrepreneur, like within a larger platform, or do you think that you need to have machine identity plus something else?
I think you need to have machine identity plus something else. So it's like you say you get visibility and inventory into all of your machine identity. Okay, so what? Well, what does that have access to from a privilege perspective, and what does that access look like, and where is the risk? I think that is actually the more interesting way to mitigate risk, and that's where the actual opportunity is. I don't know what all these companies are doing or thinking on the roadmaps, but I can tell you their marketing materials do not necessarily show that.
So you talk about overfunding. I guess the question we tried to prompt here was like, why VCs want to fund at any startups. What has happened in the past 2 or 3 years why do VCs care where they may not have cared in the past? So what are the things that people are talking about inside your investment committees when they're making a case, yes, we should fund a $20 million investment in this identity company?
Well, I don't know if we didn't care before, so I guess I would push back a little bit on that. But in terms of,
should I answer my own question as a prompt? No, I'm thinking. I'm trying to see how I can stimulate discussion. So
I disagree with the premise.
Exactly. This is how we usually talk. But I care a lot about exit analysis. I think every VC has a different thing they care about. Some people may care about market. Some people may care about founders. But especially in an environment where either in identity security, most of the exits are sub $500 million, then I think it's really important to understand what the buyers of these companies are looking for. So that's something I care about. It's just my personal thing. And so every time we write a memo, we'll list out what we think are the 5 most probabilistic outcomes for people to buy, and then we'll literally try and pick up the phone and call some of those corporate buyers to say, what are you looking for? What are the features that you're missing, et cetera, et cetera. And that informs at least some of the decision-making that we have at Okta Ventures. Now, a lot of times when we're talking to other VCs, they'll say, well, Okta bought Auth0 for X billion dollars, right? Then, obviously this is a market that's attractive. And so I think people tend to anchor on those very large exits and assume that there's appetite within the corporate buyers of a particular space for similar sized acquisitions. So maybe my question there is, if VCs are interested in the space simply because of exits, is that the right approach?
Yeah. Well, one, I would say that VCs do that across all spaces. We always anchor to the biggest outcomes. I think it's a good proof point to show that there's a market there, there's demand there, that you can actually grow and build kind of a very big, enduring business in that category. So it's a great proof point, and kind of the art of the possible for kind of a new startup. I would say, I think within identity specifically, look, I think about within cyber, there's a natural kind of obsolescence rate that's really driven by the adversary. which I think makes investing quite exciting because there's constant renewal. But I think about cyber and including identity across like 4 different vectors. Like, what are the changes in the threat landscape? What are the changes in terms of the attack surfaces? What are the enabling technologies that allow us to, provide better controls? And what are some of the forcing functions that are being employed by compliance and regulations as well? And I think across all 4 of those, we are seeing huge kind of technology shifts that are enabling a lot of companies to really rethink all spaces, but identity as one of them. And so I think given how transformational AI is, given how now widely adopted cloud is, given how there are, companies are learning to be much savvier about interoperability, about authentication, et cetera, given that we have a data infrastructure that can actually absorb this information and make sense of it, I think there are huge opportunities just within those meta trends that can it's like a good feeding ground for new companies to emerge. And so I think we try to look at more of these like secular trends. And then on an individual company basis, then it becomes kind of a much more micro-analysis on that team, on kind of what they're building, their ability to execute, and the market they're going after.
Sorry, I didn't. I just saw your question. Yeah.
Great discussion. So we talk about what are the opportunities. What are the things that VCs really want to stay away from at the moment? There's a lot of there's always something that's super hyped in the market. What are the things if they're coming to your table you say, this is really on the blacklist at the moment until it really settles down?
I have a lot of thoughts. So actually, despite what I just said, for me, if you're specifically only focused on non-human identity without a bigger vision, that would be something I would personally stay away from. Outside of identity broadly, and I actually think I might be in the minority on this one, security for AI, dedicated... I didn't mean to steal it. Did you? Oh, thank you. Security for AI is a market that is being massively funded. And I'm not sure that this is a problem that necessarily needs differentiated or focused tools. And so everyone's getting money. People are trying to solve these use cases. People want to talk about it. I don't know what the ratio of venture funding to actual enterprise spend on dedicated tools in the space are, but I think it's a ratio that would make most people feel very uncomfortable. And so I'd say those are the 2 areas that I'm a little bit wary of. It's a long list, though. We can sit down afterwards. I can tell you all the things I hate if you want.
Positive group of people here. Meet us outside.
So security for AI, I agree. And I think there is a problem to solve there, but my concern is that, the sands are still shifting. We're still figuring out what AI is going to look like in the enterprise from a model perspective, from these API calls, from applications, and so forth. And there is an opportunity, should these AI companies choose to seize it, to really build and embed a lot of security controls into their tools. I mean, read all the blogs about OpenAI and like the safety issues and the Tiger teams, whatever they're building. But should they want to, in the past you've had these large platforms kind of seed that market to third parties to really come in and provide security. They were like, look, I think Microsoft had this policy, gave rise to like Symantec, McAfee, before AWS. All of these cloud providers have kind of had this shared responsibility model, though, are now coming back into security as well. So I think it's a question mark. And so coming in at these like really, high valuations, I think it's you're leaping without kind of anything on the other side. And I think it just makes us a little bit more cautious. I think there are companies that will solve it and they'll be really exciting, but we're hesitating.
Actually, let me add one thing to that. I think the last point, there will be companies that solve this. And just to get into the mindset of how I have to think about making decisions, in my small seed stage security fund, I might make one bet. I can only really make one bet in each space. And my confidence in my ability to pick out the right team pre-product that is going to be the one or one of the very few to solve this big problem out of the dozens that I've met, I just don't believe in that. So I think in 2 or 3 years, a lot of these seeds-funded companies will go away. Some will have momentum. They'll be ready for B capital. And at that point, I think you can make a smarter or a higher probability bet on which one's going to win. So it's not that I don't think there's something to do, but for my risk appetite, picking the one out of the dozens, I just don't believe in my ability to do that. And I think it's a bit of a crapshoot.
Yeah, VCs say they're not scared, but they definitely get scared when they go into some of these high categories. Especially if they come in at the Series A and there's already 10 other funded companies. You know, it feels better when you have some breathing room. Sorry, you have a question?
I was just wondering, how much does the potential social impact, or I suppose unintended negative consequence of what a company is building come into your minds when you're making decisions about what to fund?
Wow, that's a great question. That's like literally one of the best questions I've ever heard at a VC panel.
So I'll say it's not something I wrestle with a lot because for the most part for my strategy, it's pretty much straight down the middle enterprise security. So as an example, I have been pitched offensive cybersecurity companies before. I would personally not do that. And I unintended consequences, and listen, there are other people for that strategy. I think probably in defense tech, you run into some similar challenges, but for me, I'll be honest, I don't really have to struggle with it that much because if an enterprise CISO doesn't care about it, I'm probably not investing. And those tools tend to be, I think it's less of an issue in that space.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't think those like questions of ethics come up in some of these categories that we're talking about. It has come up in the past around some questions around how people are treating like data privacy. And so I think we take that very seriously. And there are companies in my past careers where we've seen them. They're providing immense value around, like, for instance, like location data or something, and there is a market for it, a huge market for it. But the reputation risk is pretty high, and how people are handling that data, and how people are sharing that data. There are a lot of questions where if we don't feel comfortable with all of those, we will pass. It's not going to be a fit for us. So.
I'm just going to tack on this. This is such a good question. I'm going to say 3 sort of slightly tangentially connected things, and I'll give you very real examples because I think it's an interesting question. The first one is just like, how do you think about investing, ethics, all the rest of that? We have management questionnaires. I mean, we actually ask our founders, are you under lawsuit? Have you, whatever. We try and do some of that screening, which is really important. A lot of people don't do that. And so I found myself sharing that questionnaire with a lot of other folks. It's something we adopted from our friends at Salesforce. So anyhow, there's some checks and balances that you try and do there, and you'd be amazed at the stuff you find when you're doing diligence on companies. Doesn't happen that often, but when it does happen, I feel good that there's a process in place. I'm going to talk about 2 companies. There's a company out there that I've been talking to that essentially is doing sort of continuous authentication using the camera, right? So if I'm sitting and I'm a remote worker, let's say, in a call center, right? So I work at home, and I lift my camera up. I lift my phone up to the screen to take a picture or whatever. There's object detection on the laptop, right, that can detect that a cell phone is being held up for a potential picture of the screen, right? If I step away from the office, then it'll know that there's no more presence there, right? These are interesting questions, right? Because when we think about work, we're like, well, maybe I want to pick my nose, or I want to, whatever it is that you want to do in the privacy of your own workspace, right? You feel that you have a right to that. But at the same time, right, the attack vectors are real. If people are taking photos of PII on their computer, that's real. If they have a background that shows that they're not at home, because you could actually fingerprint the background of a home now, right? Okay, so this is what your home office looks like, and now we see that you're at a Starbucks somewhere. There's an argument to be made that there's continuous auth reasons that you should have that, right? And so it brings into some interesting questions. I'll give you another example as well. So imagine that you badge into work. Let me put this a different way. Imagine you wake up in the morning, and then maybe that's not you is the right example. Imagine a person who is mentally disturbed, logs in. Yeah, we're trying to give an example here. I want to be really practical because I think this really gets to the point. I want to make sure this illustration is clear. But imagine there's someone who is a threat, right? They're having mental issues, right? They're able to log into their computer using SSO, whatever, right? They're able to walk into the office. They're able to badge in, right? But meanwhile, over the past 24, 48 hours, they've been posting threats on Twitter. Today, there is no real-time personal consumer identity ingestion tool from a security standpoint that's factoring in those signals into that person's authentication. So the badge reader system is different than the SSO, and none of that is actually looking holistically at the person and the threat signals that they send. Now, if you talk to a GSOC team at a large company, they actually do this type of tracking. They may find, you might have an employee that comes up and says, I'm being stalked by my ex-girlfriend or boyfriend, and they will literally conduct investigations to track these people. But these types of signals are not being put in. So I think the idea of like a more holistic view of these security issues and how they start coming into your personal life is something we're going to have to struggle with, and they're going to have to be lines that we clearly dictate as time goes on. This is no longer like the inconvenience of an MFA push. It's starting to get, frankly, a little bit more invasive, a little bit more clear, right? And obviously there's things like gate detection and all these other things that wrap up in your sort of exhaust data as a person and how you exist. And while it can be within the confines of your office, it may start entering into your home. So I just wanted to make sure I answered that question. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I can't resist bringing up a verifiable credentials question.
It is a VC panel.
So 2023 seemed from outside to be a kind of long winter for funding verifiable credentials, and there are quite a few companies in the space. How are you seeing that in 2024? What is your view of that reaching kind of mainstream and exit value?
I'm probably the one that can answer this, but
I think so. But maybe let me give a broad comment on just the funding atmosphere in general. So it's not specific to this, and I think Austin will say something smarter in a second. But from my perspective, seed funding is just as strong as it ever was. There's a lot of capital. People are doing deals. I think Series A funding, the bar has gone up, but there still are a lot of deals getting done. And I would say they're generally done, the top deals, $15 to $20 million Series A's, 70, 80, even $100 million post. That tends to be for the best companies. At the A, however, if you're not one of the best companies, or your metrics don't, I don't want to say best companies, if your metrics don't show that you are one of the top companies, I think it's really, really hard. And then I think it gets progressively harder at every stage beyond that. And while there's plenty of growth funding available out there, dry powder for investments, you might not like the valuations you're going to get. And I think, Suman can speak much more to that piece of it than I can, but I think, just because you raised an expensive Series A doesn't mean you're entitled to an expensive Series B. And I think that's the reality that a lot of folks are meeting. But as long as you can wrap your mind around that and kind of reset expectations, like if someone told you your company would be valued at $200 million in 4 years, you'd probably be pretty happy. Although mentally, if your company was valued at $500 million in the interim, you might not feel so good about it. And so I think in general, there's a lot of capital out there, but the bar is very high. And I've seen more pushback on valuations than I've ever seen before, essentially. And eventually that becomes a founder and a board decision. Do you even want to raise more money? Maybe the best thing to do is, you have to decide, do I want to work another 3 years to maybe make less money than I could make right now as a founder? And that's a conversation, honestly, that I have quite a bit with my friends in this business.
Yeah, I'll just add to the market in general. It's not just, verifiable credentials that I think, saw kind of a hit maybe in 23. But to John's point, seed might be pretty active. Growth has been quiet. Like we are ramping definitely more so now. But, as our fund last year was, we spent a lot of time with companies, but we didn't really pull the trigger. And it's because there was a hangover from 21 and 22 where there was just so much funding going in and overvaluations. We were in kind of the ZERP economy, zero interest rate. And, people just had so much kind of promise that kind of run was going to last forever. And so 23 was a huge correction and kind of resetting. And I think it hit companies at the, A to growth stages the most, because a lot of those companies just didn't have the performance that kind of met the new multiple expectations on valuation. And so that's been kind of and that reset is still continuing, by the way. And it doesn't mean that there aren't exciting problems to solve, that there aren't great companies out there. the bar is just a lot higher because I think everyone is trying to kind of rebalance their portfolio, understand kind of how they want to make those bets going forward. So it's not so domain specific. It is kind of a global thing. I know there's one more question.
Yeah, a verifiable credential to me is only as valuable as the wallet it sits in. And for years people have been talking about the wallet wars and who's going to win. I think really at the end of the day, it's a Google and Apple discussion because we all hold these wallets right now today. When I think about it, Austin's answer to this is that it's going to be in another market, that there's an opportunity for super apps in other markets where there's not entrenched things. And so we've invested in the largest consumer identity company in Indonesia. Okta doesn't even, I think we have very small number of customers in Indonesia today, but there was a case to be made. This company's verified 40 million identities. We invested in a company called Accredify in Singapore, which is doing verifiable credentials. And it's why is Okta investing in a verifiable credential company in Singapore? Well, it just turns out that in Singapore, you can create standards, right? They get adopted in Southeast Asia, which has, 700, 800 million people that live there. So I'm trying to look for other avenues as opposed to, areas where there may be entrenched wallets. So there was a couple other questions. I think you asked first. Yeah, the beard, yeah.
It's kind of a segue off of what you just said about going to other markets. I'm curious where you three find novel deal flow, because obviously there's Identiverse and there's trusted networks of other service providers and other VCs. Is it a subreddit? Is it like something?
That's an awesome question. Yeah. So we were talking to actually these guys. Junction, is that the name of your company? Yeah. So I was talking to those guys. Interestingly, like the COVID certificates, there's startups that have popped up in all sorts of different countries. So they were basically involved in some sort of government contract, and then they started this is we can build this into a consumer wallet. We can go private and start. So there's all sorts of different pockets of areas. Obviously, you have your little mafias as well, and I think John can talk about that in terms of some of his investing in Israel, some of the really good pockets of entrepreneurs that have been there. And so there's a whole DNA lineage that you can trace. You can get close to those founders. So there's all sorts of different pockets. For us, I spent 12 years of my life professionally living outside the United States. So I'm quite comfortable with taking country risk, whereas maybe other people are I don't know anything about Indonesia. I've worked in Indonesia before. So for me to see an Indonesian identity company, I feel more comfortable with that. That's the risk that I'm maybe predestined to take on. So everyone's got their own little twist, but maybe you have some secrets.
I mean, I don't have that many secrets. I think I get to benefit from, early stage investors a ton, and I, get to rely on their judgment and their kind of amazing networks as well. I think the deal flow that I am always excited to get is when CISOs or practitioners send me companies, I will always take a look. And I will always, even if I have questions about I don't know, I will stay on it much longer because I know that there is a buyer there who's interested, and it's up to me to figure out why this is interesting, and if it's something that can be bigger. But I would say that's
a great tip.
That's my best signal.
Yeah, have your customers pitch the VCs.
And it's great to be able to get that. I feel really privileged.
So it's funny you say that because I'm investing pre-product. So actually when a CISO brings me an opportunity, I would say oftentimes it's a need they have, but they're generally not thinking about, is the team backable? Can they go to market? Do they have the technological abilities? Do they have the right network? So for me, especially because there's no product to evaluate, I would say it is I think you used the phrase trusted networks, and that is essentially what it is. I mean, I'm an Irish boy from Boston, and I spend 67 nights a year in Tel Aviv. I had to work really hard to build that community over there in that network. But now that it's established, I will tell you even the okay deals that get sent my way from that network, and it's generally founders, is incredible. And I learn a ton. And very rarely do I have a meeting from that kind of group where I say that wasn't worth my time because I learned so much from these folks, even if it's not something I'm going to do. So especially in Israel where I don't live and I spend a lot of time, I would say it's trusted networks. And it's similar here. I will say it's actually, I live in San Francisco now, and it's harder for me to cover the U.S. as a bucket than it is for me to cover Israel. Because I go over to Tel Aviv once or twice a quarter. I got a week, and I barely go off of Rothschild Boulevard. I don't really have to go searching for things. In the U.S., there's so many different pockets of talent, but you've got D.C., you have Boston and New York, you have Silicon Valley, you've got Chicago. I mean, good companies come out of Austin as one, and I'm the only person who works at my firm. So it's very hard for me to cover all of that. So just as an efficiency thing, I'm really relying on relationships and people that I trust to send me deal flow. And it's impossible to catch everything, but I found it's the best way for me to kind of sort through these things.
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, behind you. Yeah. Or you? No, yeah, yes.
Yeah, so related to the previous topic about the general correction and contraction potentially of the VC funding market, I'm curious if you guys have seen changes relative to that for performance metrics at the various stages.
Yeah.
Revenue mix in general, maybe less a question for pre-seed, but more like seed, Series A onward.
Yeah, so I live it after I write the check. Then I have to live. I'm on their side of the table before the Series A. So I would say the number that I think everyone says for a Series A is like $1 million in ARR. I will tell you that I don't know any companies that actually get to $1 million. If they're on their way to $1 million, I think it usually happens before that. What I think is more important, I think you said revenue mix, but I would say quality of logos. So, $300K in ARR, but from large enterprises that are using the product the same way, and that's what I coach my CEOs on this all the time. Your Series A investors, Series B investors, anyone, they're going to talk to your customers. And if they have 3 totally different conversations with these customers, it starts to look like a relationship sale, and there's a question if you have product market fit. And so I would say quality of logo and consistency of usage or use case is really, really important, and you'll get a huge premium on that. I'll give you another example because I've worked with so many Israeli companies. Israeli customers for Israeli startups get discounted massively because the assumption is it's kind of friends and family, and I'll tell you the assumption is correct. It's usually friends. It doesn't mean they're not good customers, and doesn't mean that they're not building good product. But if you want to compare kind of, pick your Israeli customer and then compare that to, a Fortune 100 in the U.S., that Fortune 100 in the U.S. is going to get a much higher value from a perspective, from a valuation perspective. And I would say that you go back to 2021, my companies were raising Series A's with no revenue consistently. I haven't seen that at all in this environment.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, theoretically, our job is to draw slope lines, right? So it's like point. So one of the weird things is when founders come to you and they say, well, I have this amount of revenue, and that's the first engagement that you have with them as an investor. Now that you start the chart there. And so what you're actually looking for is the email a month later, hey, we just landed a couple more, and a couple more. And so you want to think about when you start that engagement, because actually it's a momentum play. So it's less about, you hit 1 million in ARR. It's more about, you hit 5 customers last month. Something's happened. I'll give you a quick example. We have a very young company that we invested out of Y Combinator. And, 6 months after we invested in Y Combinator, they landed a public company inbound, totally cold. This company has no website, basically no presence at all. And now the founder showed me multiple emails that she's getting from her website of people saying, I need this RFP filled. Please send me your information. That to me is a momentum play because I've had a chance to see it for the past year. Those metrics may not be there, the sort of standard rubric metrics, but I see this path that's going. And so I'm very excited about them being able to raise a Series A because I could see the momentum that's going. I know other people see it too. So big logos, double-clicking, like John was saying, is really important.
Yeah. So I think echo everything that they've said. As a growth investor, so we like to meet startups early and build those relationships early and try to get to know each other. If we're excited, try to demonstrate value as they kind of grow into that growth stage. But I think, and so we're tracking kind of progress as well, and we are keeping track. If plan is to hit 1 million, did they hit 1 million? Did they beat it? Or did they miss? And what does that look like? But we also in 23, I would say the pendulum swung very hard towards efficiency versus kind of the cost at all, growth at all costs approach that we had. And so we've kind of moved a little bit away from that, you must be, I feel like the VCs have been kind of taking these startups, taking our founders for a ride because we were just here's more money, spend it, grow revenue. And then it's why aren't you cash flow positive yet? It was a stark change, and apologies on behalf of everyone who's told you that. But we have it has kind of moved a little bit more towards the middle. I would say for us, we are very, very metrics driven, and we like to see momentum is important because we're really looking for escape velocity, right? And at the growth stages, we need big outcomes to deliver the returns and the, hit the benchmarks that we're underwriting to, that our LPs are expecting. And so we need to see that you're not only going to be kind of a company that is, seen maybe that early, like 5 billion. We want to see you, how are you going to get to 100, right? Because that's kind of where we're hoping to kind of be able to deliver that exit minimum. And so that's kind of what we're looking for. And the ways that we're thinking about that is not only very strong growth, over time, but then how are you growing efficiently? And what does that mean in terms of every dollar that you put into sales and marketing or R&D? How many dollars is that yielding? What is your burn? And we're definitely favoring those companies that can prove out that they can grow very well, very efficiently, like this company Austin's talking about that has a tremendous amount of inbound. I mean, that is like a very good signal of product market fit. It should feel easy, right? That's kind of when you have that unlock and you have more faith that you can reach that escape velocity. So I think that's what we're looking at.
And VCs are, this is literally, I'll tell you exactly what's happening in our investment committee discussions and even some discussions with our M&A team. We see the same early adopters. I got the 5-minute warning there. See the early adopters, right, as a first bucket, but they're the same early adopter buyers. It's like the same CISOs. So to John's point, you kind of discredit it, right? So, but that's fine. It's the normal path is friends and family. Then maybe you tap into the network of your VCs. And then you need to actually create an engine of real organic growth. Certainly by the time you get to Sum on stage at B Capital, you better have very nice spreadsheets with lots of logos.
For you, it's okay.
This is the growth stage investors. Tough business over there.
I might just add, because we're talking about expectation setting, and I think this is a bit implied how to present kind of your traction to investors. This is a very small community. I would say never lie, and I would say don't even exaggerate. I have been in situations where I have, and again, this is pre-products, there isn't even that much to validate, and I'll see a slide with our design partners. And I mean, this is a security community is not huge. And so I've been on calls where they're explaining to me their design partners, and I'll just text the CISO and say, hey, what do you think? Is this great? And they'll be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Now, conversely, if it's true, it's amazing, and that's a great way to get validation. But I would say be very careful about just having to walk anything back. And, we see so many pitches, like a loss of credibility or trust is like a really easy way to disqualify something, even if it's an amazing idea or amazing company. Like, we've just got to make heuristic decisions. And so I would just say be very careful, especially when you get to the Series B, when you talk about pipeline. If you say, oh, we're like in legal negotiations or at the end of the road or 95% chance we're going to close these 4 customers, and then Suman calls these 4 customers and you're not there, that really hurts your ability or your credibility with investors.
We call minimum 10 customers. And, we ask a question of how do you rate this company and this vendor product on a scale of 1 to 10? And we try to invest only in companies that, customers consistently say this is a 9 or 10. We care a lot about that. The other thing I'll say about efficiency is try to think about an expansion story. It's very expensive to get to only rely on new customers for revenue growth. And if you have a product that has kind of an expansion story, it can really kind of help things. And we're always looking at that too.
All right, 3 minutes. Coolest new startup category that you're seeing. I'm starting because I asked the question, and it's 3 minutes, and I talk too long. AI agents, right? So we think of bots as bad, but what if a bot is good? So you have your virtual AI agent and it needs to go out and book a reservation for you. Then how do you permission bots to come into OpenTable, right? Or you have 5,000 friends on Twitter and you want to respond to all their DMs. How do you have someone who's your AI agent that's read all of your blogs and all of your online content that has your voice? How are they responding to all those different DMs? That's a really cool category. A bunch of young startups trying to figure that out. Really hard and completely different architecture. And And then there was something else. Oh, well, deepfake detection, so continuous auth with visual cues, right? So that basically requires enrollment. You're going to need to take a photo, face on, left, right. It's going to kind of look like a non-FIDO flow, but really every employee in 2 or 3 years' time, when you have your first day at work, you're going to have a full enrollment just like you would if you're going for TSA pre. That's my prediction. And then you'll have continuous auth coming in through Zoom calls. Because deepfakes are very real. I've seen them. If you saw the Hong Kong attack that happened, I had a chance to demo that software. It's astounding how accurate it is. They can literally flip through faces every 2 seconds. It's really amazing.
Well, if we're going out there, I think one thing that I think is really interesting, we'll see kind of how the market shapes out around this, but I think it's an important problem is, how we think about protecting IP and kind of next-gen watermarking. I think the art community is doing a lot in this space, but I think it has a lot of transferable applications across a number of different use cases, and it's going to become a necessity, like how we actually, and I don't think, it's only going to be like a blockchain type answer. It has to be something that is, probably, more robust and more kind of easy to integrate. But I think there's some interesting folks doing stuff.
Yeah, and then I'll say I tend to get excited by boring stuff, as I'm about to demonstrate. I love the security operations center. I love the SOC because there's a lot of budget. I think there's going to be a massive decoupling of the data layer and the analytics layer within the SOC, and I think there's a ton of opportunity in both of those spaces to do some really, really interesting stuff. Again, it's not as cool as deepfakes, but I think there's some very big companies to be built there.
Let's not end the discussion. If you have a question or anything or disagree with something, just come on up to the stage. But I think that's it for us. Thanks.
Thank you.